In the 36th book of Ab Urbe Condita, Livy introduces the clash between the Romans and the forces of Antiochus III by remarking that Thermopylae, the site of their battle, was nobilis Lacedaemonorium adversus persas morte, famous for the deaths of the Spartans in the struggle against Persia. By the time he was writing these words, almost half a millennium had passed since the Battle of Thermopylae, in which Leonidas and his tiny contingent of Greeks had made a stand against the vast Persian forces under Xerxes. Yet, Livy nevertheless assumed that his Roman readers would recognize Thermopylae not as the narrow pass in which their own forces had defeated Antiochus, but where the Spartans had given their lives. But how did the Romans understand their sacrifice? In this paper, I will investigate the parallels that were drawn between the Battle of Thermopylae and Roman conflicts of various kinds in Latin and Greek literature. My discussion will take a rather perplexing passage from Pseudo-Plutarch's Parallela Minora as a base from which to consider the ways in which Leonidas was invoked as an exemplum of patriotic self-sacrifice in earlier texts. By focusing on the connections forged between Greece and Rome, I will demonstrate that the identification of a Roman Leonidas was no idle act, but must be understood in the context of an ongoing debate about the kinds of behavior which constitute sacrificing oneself for one's community. So let's begin with Parallela Minora. In essence, Parallela Minora is a collection of 41 brief comparisons of individuals from Roman and non-Roman history. It was attributed to Plutarch by the so-called Catalogue of Lamprias, a list of the biographer's works compiled in the 4th century AD. However, it's now generally agreed that its archaic forms and factual errors indicate that it was penned by a different author. Parallela Minora offers few clues as to the identity of this pseudo-Plutarch, but he was probably writing in the early 2nd century AD, sometime after Plutarch composed Parallel Lives. It has been suggested that Parallela Minora was written as a parody of this monumental biographical work. And when we turn to the comparison involving Leonidas, it's perhaps not too difficult to see why. Pseudo-Plutarch writes, and I'll read the translation. When the Persians were marching with 5 million men against Greece, Leonidas was sent by the Spartans to Thermopylae with 300 men. And when he rushed against the barbarians and was pierced by many a spear, he made his way up to Xerxes and snatched off his crown. So Aristides in the first book of his Persian histories. When the Romans were at war with the Carthaginians, they dispatched 300 men and Fabius Maximus as their general. He attacked the enemy and lost all his men, but he himself, although mortally wounded, with a mad rush reached Hannibal and knocked down his crown, and so died with him. This Aristides the Milesian relates. This is a striking parallel, to say the least. In the first instance, Fabius Maximus did not die in battle. According to Livy and Plutarch proper, Fabius was carried off by illness. As such, Pseudo-Plutarch's description of Fabius's last-ditch act of defiance against Hannibal appears to be a fabrication. Yet, he names a source, Aristides of Miletus. This Aristides is a figure as obscure as Pseudo-Plutarch. His 3 multi-volume works of history are first mentioned by Pseudo-Plutarch, who refers to him by name no less than 21 times in Parallela Minora. In this excerpt alone, he is cited twice, both as a source for Fabius's death and also for Leonidas's. It's worth noting that a similar version of Fabius's supposed battlefield demise appears in a fragment of Litus's On Months, written in the 6th century, and possibly also in the Pseudo. In the case of Leonidas, who we will examine in more detail in a moment, his supposed crown snatching is also mentioned by Litus and in Stobaeus' 5th century anthology, both of whom name Aristides as a source. So who might this Aristides have been? The most prevalent theory is that Aristides was invented by Pseudo-Plutarch. This theory has found favour for two reasons. Firstly, the stories supposedly found in Aristides' histories differ to such a degree from other accounts that one would expect that he would be more widely cited, if only to be maligned for his errors. And secondly, Aristides' version of events seems to fit so neatly with Pseudo-Plutarch's parallels, perhaps too neatly. To my mind, it certainly seems convenient that Pseudo-Plutarch could find an account in which Fabius so closely resembles Leonidas. But, for the purposes of this argument, it matters less where Pseudo-Plutarch obtained this version of Fabius's demise, and more that he chose to record it. After all, this description of Fabius dying in battle against Hannibal does not merely differ from other accounts of his death, but also runs counter to the conduct for which the Cunctator became renowned. Following the disaster at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, Fabius, then dictator, began to avoid engaging Hannibal's forces. Initially, Fabius's tactics attracted considerable scorn, with his fellow Romans accusing him of cowardice, and, in so doing, denying the soldiers under his command an opportunity to display their own bravery. Accordingly, a more offensive strategy was adopted. However, after the Romans were annihilated at Cannae in 216 BC, Fabius was elected as a suffect consul, and resumed his policy of delay, which garnered great respect this time around. Fabius is frequently invoked as an exemplum in Latin texts, where his delaying strategy is portrayed in a markedly favourable light. Fabius also appears in Greek texts, most notably Plutarch's Parallel Lives, where he is paired with Pericles. As such, a good portion of Pseudo-Plutarch's readers would surely have been aware that Fabius did not die on the battlefield. Compared with Fabius, Pseudo-Plutarch's description of Leonidas is somewhat more accurate. Pseudo-Plutarch's Leonidas meets his end at Thermopylae, while commanding a contingent of 300 Spartans. If you discount the fact that Leonidas's hoplite army contained soldiers from other poleis, and the likelihood that there were more than the traditional 300 Spartans present, so far, so good. However, the moment of Leonidas's death is more objectionable. According to Diodorus, Justin, and Plutarch, Leonidas and his troops entered the Persian camp in order to search for Xerxes. But in none of these accounts do the Spartans actually succeed. Yet here, Pseudo-Plutarch claims that Leonidas located Xerxes, and, with his dying breath, knocked his crown from his head, the same striking and conspicuous act supposedly undertaken by Fabius. Considering that Pseudo-Plutarch was writing in Greek, it is reasonable, I think, to presume that his readers would have had some knowledge of other accounts of the Battle of Thermopylae, and thus that they would recognize the perplexing addition of crown snatching. Why, then, would Pseudo-Plutarch draw a parallel between Leonidas and Fabius on the basis that they both knocked crowns from their enemies' heads just before they died? In order to understand the purpose of this erroneous connection, we need to step back and examine the operation of the Leonidas exemplum in earlier texts. By the time Pseudo-Plutarch composed Parallela Minora, Leonidas, and the Battle of Thermopylae more broadly, was invoked in two kinds of parallels with Rome. Firstly, in discussions of self-sacrifice in battle, and secondly, in the endeavour to cast conduct in the civic sphere as commensurate with sacrificing one's life in battle. Accordingly, I will discuss two Republican accounts, each of which demonstrates the trajectories along which the Leonidas exemplum would develop. The first of these is a fragment of Cato the Elder's Origenes. Written sometime between 180 and 149 BC, this is the earliest extant parallel between Leonidas and a figure from Roman history. But this fragment is preserved in a considerably later text, namely Aulus Gellius's mid-2nd century AD Noctes Atticae. Gellius's chapter is divided into two halves. In the first half, Gellius provides an account of Caedicius, a military tribune from the First Punic War. After the Roman army was ambushed by the Carthaginians, this Caedicius apparently led a contingent of 400 to distract the enemy, allowing the rest of the Romans to escape. All of Caedicius's men were slaughtered, but he miraculously survived to serve Rome another day. In the second half of the chapter, Gellius claims to be quoting Cato directly. This is the point at which Caedicius and Leonidas are compared, and again I'll read the translation. But what a difference it makes where you do the same service. The Laconian Leonidas, who performed a like exploit at Thermopylae, because of his valour, won unexampled glory and gratitude from all Greece, and was honoured with memorials of the highest distinction. They showed their appreciation of that deed of his by pictures, statues, and honorary inscriptions in their histories and in other ways. But the tribune of the soldiers, who had done the same thing and saved an army, gained small glory for his deeds. Here, Cato laments that Caedicius has not enjoyed the same fate as Leonidas, despite performing idem benefactum, the same service. The service in question is described only in vague terms in the quotation. Gellius's description of Caedicius appears to be a paraphrased version of Origenes, indicating that Cato once provided an account of the tribune's attempted self-sacrifice. But what about Leonidas, whom Cato designates by name? Ordinarily, the inclusion of a name would hardly be worthy of note. But, as Nepos and Pliny the Elder remark, Cato systematically omitted the names of military men. Instead, he designated individuals using official titles. Here, Caedicius is the military tribune, and elsewhere, Hannibal is deemed the Carthaginian dictator. Yet, Cato gives Leonidas' name. This, I would suggest, was a concession to his readers to help to jog their memories. Although in this passage, Cato does include several key details about Leonidas, identifying that he was a Spartan whose courage at Thermopylae won him great renown throughout Greece, one would arguably be hard-pressed to think of a commander other than Leonidas who meets these criteria. But would a Roman of the 2nd century BC have thought the same? It is unclear whether Cato provided an account of the Battle of Thermopylae. He certainly does not do so in this passage, or in any other fragment of Origenes. But if he did not describe Thermopylae, where might his readers have learnt about this battle? Now, I don't want to dwell on this question due to the lack of evidence, but there are 2 points worth noting. Firstly, there is no extant description of Thermopylae in Latin literature at this time, meaning that for those who could not read Greek, it is unclear where they could have learnt about this battle. Secondly, though Cato's endeavour to liken Leonidas to Caedicius relies on his audience perceiving the parallels between them, all a reader would really need to know is that Leonidas, like Caedicius, willingly offered his life in the defense of his homeland. But why include Leonidas at all? Caedicius courageously offering his life in order to save the consular army seems, to me, to warrant admiration in and of itself. Accordingly, the parallel Cato draws must enhance the esteem Caedicius already garnered through his battlefield bravery. Notice that it is Leonidas who performs the same deed as Caedicius, even though chronologically, Leonidas sacrificed himself first. It is thus clear that Cato is using Leonidas as a benchmark against which to measure Caedicius's act, and in so doing, demonstrating that the Romans are more than capable of equaling the Spartans' great achievement. Cato's parallel between Leonidas and Caedicius exerted enormous force over subsequent texts. They appeared in Florus's Epitome and Ampelius's Liber Memoralis, and appear together in lists in Frontinus's Stratagems and a letter by Seneca the Younger. Its influence can be seen even in a text where Thermopylae is not mentioned. According to Livy, Caedicius's contingent numbered not 400, but 300. Additionally, Leonidas appears alongside better-known Roman war heroes in Valerius Maximus's chapter on bravery and in Cicero's De Finibus, to which we will now turn. In this treatise of 45 BC, Cicero invokes the Leonidas exemplum to criticize the Epicurean theory that all men should seek pleasure by pointing to the superiority of the virtue of courage. Initially, it seems that little has changed since Origenes, with Cicero introducing Leonidas after describing the acts of Duotio each of the 3 Decii undertook on the battlefield. But then, things take a turn in a rather different direction, where Cicero writes, "The Greeks have but a modest list, Leonidas, Epaminondas, some 3 or 4. But were I to begin to cite the heroes of our race, daylight would fail before I had done. Why, you yourself, you won that office for your gallant father. It was with his support that I carried through an affair which was for all men's interests rather than my own." Here, rather than a one-to-one parallel, Leonidas is placed within a list of courageous individuals, which includes Epaminondas, the 4th century Theban general who was in command when the Spartans were defeated at Leuctra. Cicero provides even fewer details about Epaminondas and Leonidas than Cato did in Origenes, referring to them only by name. As such, it is clear that Cicero expected his readers would have some knowledge of the conduct which warrants Leonidas's inclusion on this list. The importance of this is not to be overlooked. To my knowledge, after Cato's Origenes, Leonidas does not reappear in Latin literature until this passage from De Finibus. That's a gap of over 100 years. Yet, Cicero's willingness to refer to him by name alone indicates that the Thermopylae tale remained in circulation in some form at Rome, at least among the educated elite. The Roman examples in this excerpt all revolve around the Catilinarian conspiracy. Cicero first alludes to the conduct of his interlocutor, Lucius Manlius Torquatus, designated through the second person you, who assisted his father, of the same name, to attain the consulship of 65 BC. Torquatus Jr. did this by prosecuting one of the designated consuls, Publius Sylla, for ambitus. After Sylla and the other incoming consul were both found guilty, Torquatus Sr. was elected. Cicero then refers to the affair in all men's interest, namely his efforts to execute the Catilinarian conspirators during his own consulship in 63. This allusion arguably extends to an event in 62, where Cicero defended Sylla, the one who lost the consulship. This time he had been charged with conspiring with Catiline by none other than Torquatus Jr. Cicero secured Sulla's acquittal, but it seems that this trial placed strain on the relationship between Cicero and the Torquati. This is a markedly complex and controversial series of events, all wrapped up in a neat series of allusions, in which Torquatus Jr. is praised for assisting Torquatus Sr., Torquatus Sr. for assisting Cicero, and finally, Cicero praises himself for subduing the Catilinarians. So, why place all this alongside Leonidas? Because his example of courageous self-sacrifice is simple, straightforward, and vitally uncontested. He, along with Epaminondas and the Decii, acted in a manner that was admirable. By listing the Catilinarian examples alongside them, Cicero is able to cast the conduct of Torquatus Sr., Jr., and particularly himself in the same light, making his behavior during his consulship seem simple, straightforward, and uncontested. This is Cicero attempting to shape his own legacy, implying that he and the Torquati acted just as bravely and with as great a personal risk as Leonidas or anyone else did when sacrificing their lives on the battlefield. There are fewer examples of these civic parallels with Leonidas. In his chapter on bravery, Valerius Maximus discusses courage shown in the forum, as well as that shown in battles, including Thermopylae. Seneca the Elder, in his Tausorii, draws connections between Leonidas' last stand and Cicero's prescription. But it seems that there were more examples of this which have not survived. In Lucian's satirical handbook, Professor of Public Speaking from the 2nd century AD, he suggests that a speaker should always, and I quote a translation, let the sun be shadowed by the arrows of the Persians, and Leonidas receive admiration. This remark that a speaker should introduce the Leonidas exemplum at every opportunity is, of course, made in jest. But, for it to be humorous, it must have some grounding in reality. Lucian may well be indicating that the Leonidas exemplum was being used ad nauseum in texts which have not survived. Returning to Parallela Minora with all this in mind, the purpose of the parallel between Leonidas and Fabius becomes rather more clear. In this chapter, we see Pseudo-Plutarch engaging thoughtfully with the ways in which the Leonidas exemplum had been used. At first glance, it seems that this is a standard battlefield parallel, with Pseudo-Plutarch comparing Leonidas to a Roman who, like Cato's Caedicius, fought the Carthaginians. But to anyone who knows anything about Fabius, this connection is baffling. Here we have a Roman renowned for his refusal to battle Hannibal, dying in battle against Hannibal, and in so doing, supposedly recalling, even emulating Leonidas. This, quite simply, is absurd, and I think that's the point. Pseudo-Plutarch is endeavoring to ridicule the tenuous parallels that were being drawn with Leonidas. Consider for a moment, for all of Cicero's efforts, are we really convinced that attaining the consulship of one's father is really comparable to Leonidas' bravery at Thermopylae? The Fabius parallel is thus not only a source of humour, but also a cause for concern. Each time an author uses the Leonidas exemplum, they offer their own version of what it means to sacrifice oneself for one's country. Some of these are naturally more persuasive than others. But by the 2nd century AD, it is clear that the kinds of behaviour which constituted Leonidas-like self-sacrifice had expanded well beyond the battlefield. But at the same time as the definition of self-sacrifice was expanding, these parallels cannot help but cast each individual in the same narrow mold. If Caedicius, Torquatus, Cicero, even Fabius can be a Leonidas, what makes any of them memorable in their own right? Through this purposefully perplexing parallel, Pseudo-Plutarch is forcing his readers, perhaps above all, to consider that in the search for a Roman Leonidas, they are losing how much it once meant simply to be Leonidas.